I'm going to attempt to give an introduction to the life and work of Johann Georg Hamann, who is, on one level, one of the most important figures of the German Enlightenment and someone actually indispensable to intellectual modernity, and at the same time has become an incredibly obscure figure, especially in English. And part of understanding Hamann might be coming to an understanding of why he has become obscure, and exactly what then is distinctive about this rather strange figure. Now, I'm not going to talk about Hamann's thought in the abstract. In his case, that would be a betrayal. To a very great extent, Hamann can only be misunderstood if he is reduced to a system of doctrines or ideas or even a method. That's not the sort of figure he is. He is a writer, a philologist, a critic, a humorist, the most original and enigmatic figure of the German Enlightenment. Though he was philosophically well informed, indeed he changes the course of modern philosophy, he never seems to count himself as a philosopher, though he often compares himself to Socrates. While his writings have astonishing theological depth, he has no standing in the church except as an ordinary Christian of the Lutheran persuasion. He has no office. He has no expectation that he would be taken as any kind of a theological authority. And so he never calls or thinks of himself as a theologian. By trade, he spends most of his career as a minor customs official in Konigsberg. And this is a job that his friend Immanuel Kant got him, in fact. Kant trying to help Hamann out and give him something a little more stable than finding occasional work as a tutor. And so he spent his days translating tax documents for the government of Frederick the Great. He refers to himself as Matthew in Telonio sedens, Matthew sitting in his tax booth, as it were, waiting for Jesus to call him. Likewise, he calls himself, and is later referred to by others, as a magus, that is one of the magi, not in reference to some wizardry he performs, but as just another foreigner who follows the star to Bethlehem, the magus in the north, as he is called. Above all, Hamann is concerned with words, with the exchange of words, both between humans and, for Hamann this is not a separate topic, between God and humans. And so as often as not, he seems to be, and is, talking about words and language. It's astonishing how often he can turn a conversation about anything into a conversation about language and its specifics, points of grammar and orthography and spelling. He is a true philologist, a lover of words and of the word, and these cannot be separated. In virtue of this, the only reasonable way I can think of to explain a bit of Hamann is to treat just a few of his writings and the real human entanglements that they represent. Now, I should say a bit about the debts I owe in speaking about Hamann. There are a handful of figures who have brought him to importance, especially in theology in recent decades. The most important of these is the German Luther scholar and Hamann scholar, and really an absolutely leading figure in both, Oswald Bayer. Bayer has done tremendous work on Hamann over the decades, and that work has influenced a handful of others who have brought him into English. John Betts wrote a wonderful book on Hamann and studied with Bayer some years ago. And I cannot also forget about John Milbank, who probably more than anyone else has raised Hamann to recent prominence in theology. Though hasn't written a great deal about him, Hamann shows up at critical points in a few of Milbank's books, and the influence is clearly there. However, until recent decades, Hamann's influence on theology has been rather diffuse. He gets mentions in Barth. He's certainly discussed by Hans Urs von Balthasar. But especially in Anglophone theology, it's very difficult to find a place for him before that. And in fact, in Anglophone philosophy, discussions of Hamann could get a little bit strange. The most prominent of these in the 20th century would be that of Isaiah Berlin. And his treatment of Hamann is, to put it bluntly, unfair. He discusses Hamann as if he were a counter-Enlightenment figure, an irrationalist. These are simply misunderstandings. Grabbing hold of Hamann, then, requires holding a number of pieces together, which are normally split up. It is characteristic of most philosophical minds to sort of dissolve things into component parts and try to isolate them. And with Hamann, that's just not going to work. This leads to his famous obscurity. The method behind Hamann's madness is that he believes fervently in the fundamental unity of style and content, as of life and work. Again and again, Hamann warns his readers not to separate what God has joined, to abstractly distill into unrelated essences those things which only ever exist and find life in their concrete situation. And so to understand Hamann, we're going to have to dig just a little bit into his life, into where he was and who he was and how these things came about. Hamann was born in Konigsberg in 1730. His parents were very ordinary people, not educated. His father, Johann Christoph, was, as Hamann refers to him, the old town bather, a surgeon and bathhouse operator. Hamann compares his father's tub, the therapeutic tub in which his father would bathe his clients, to the midwife's stool of Socrates' mother. And he declares this tub holy to him, as he will in time refer to his own writings as a therapeutic tub. Now, as a young student, Hamann proved incredibly gifted in languages. Greek and Latin naturally, also English, Hebrew, French. At one point, he studied the Quran in Arabic, I think just because he could. And he's interested in absolutely everything, the sort of mind that ranges over every conceivable topic, but has trouble sitting still. Though he does return again and again to language and to a kind of theological essence of language. But this sort of restlessness, and I think his own playfulness in life, led him never to complete his degree at the University of Konigsberg. He dabbled in publishing and writing. He certainly immerses himself in the currents of the German Enlightenment as it was in that period. He found work as a tutor, and he gradually migrated to Riga, today is Latvia. There, he went to work for his friend Johann Christoph Behrens. Now, Behrens' family owned and operated a rather large trading company. And if you imagine operating throughout the Baltic and the North Sea. And Hamann is at a certain point enlisted, probably because of his language skills, and maybe just as a favor to give him something important to do, to go on a kind of diplomatic mission to London. Now, the details of this mission are lost to us. We honestly do not know exactly what was involved, although there is reason to believe that the Russian embassy was connected to this. There is a good chance that what is being worked out here is some sort of trade deal involving the Russians and the Behrens company. And so in 1757, Hamann heads off for London. What we really know about this trip is that he spends far too long in London. He's there well into 1758. He spends all of his money. He considers the trip a failure on every level. A personal disaster, a professional disaster, a profound embarrassment. Except in the middle of this, in the middle of his falling into a life which he is profoundly embarrassed by, Hamann experiences a kind of conversion. Now, perhaps we should use the word conversion loosely, in that I suppose he always did consider himself a Christian, but he would point to this time in his life ever afterwards as the time in which he really came to know who God was. And so in a very brief, intense sort of outpouring of energy, he reads the entire Bible during this time in London. And he writes a kind of spiritual autobiography in his young days. He's only 28 years old at this point. Now referred to as the London Writings. The London Writings were collected up, saved by Hamann in a few copies, but never published, not during his lifetime. They were actually eventually handed over to Jacobi, who then transmitted them back to Hamann's son. They don't come into publication for many years. Now, this time in London, it's sort of interesting to make a comparison. There was quite a large German emigre community in London at the time, but there's also a confluence of figures, not that they necessarily knew each other, they probably didn't, but who bear some kind of comparison to one another. William Blake or the poet Christopher Smart. Smart is a very interesting comparison for Hamann because he and Hamann share a profound interest in Hebrew poetry, which is very influential on their styles. But in the course of the London Writings, what emerges for Hamann is an account of what he calls God as the author of my life. There's this intertwining of the nature of Scripture and of himself, as if what happens in reading the Bible is that Hamann discovers himself there. He is the one narrated in Scripture. He is discovered there. This is perhaps the root of his notion of metaschematism. And so the one who writes Scripture, not simply the human authors, but the Spirit, is the one who has written Hamann. And this is transformative for him. He finds himself unable to abide by many of the sort of canons of style and intellectual propriety of the German Enlightenment and has to do something else. He adopts a radically different manner. So he returns to Konigsberg. And in time, his friend Behrens seeks him out and probably out of sincere concern for Hamann, tries to reconvert him to the mainstream of the Enlightenment. He's worried that he's become some sort of religious fanatic, and perhaps in a way he has. So in a strange and famous encounter, Behrens recruits a philosopher local to Konigsberg, not at this point yet known to Hamann, but they will become fast friends. This is the still relatively young and pre-critical Immanuel Kant. And Behrens and Kant meet with Hamann at an inn outside of Konigsberg and attempt to draw him back in, to convince him that he should rejoin the main intellectual currents of the age. For his part, Hamann thinks this is almost uproariously funny. He's amused by the notion that Behrens would have brought in a philosopher to convince him of anything. Clearly, he thinks himself just impervious to that sort of argument. So the first meeting doesn't necessarily go well. In time, Kant offers a bit of a peace offering between the two, an olive branch. He suggests that Hamann and he should write a book together. If you can imagine this having happened, it didn't, which is really too bad because it might have been one of the funniest disasters in the history of philosophy, but just the suggestion is humorous beyond all reason. Kant offers that together they should write a physics book for children. And Hamann, of course, thinks this is a joke. Kant does not think this is a joke. They don't share the same sense of humor. But so things, again, get off slightly on the wrong foot. In time, by 1759, Hamann writes a sort of response to Behrens and Kant. This is the first piece of his writing that I would like to talk about in any kind of detail, a piece called the Socratic Memorabilia. So the Socratic Memorabilia is a piece Hamann writes in 1759, and its audience is highly particular. It opens with a dedication collected for the boredom of the public by a lover of boredom, with a double dedication to nobody and to two. The nobody is the public, and this nobody of the public is a subject that Hamann will repeatedly return to in this writing. But the two are Christoph Behrens and Immanuel Kant. They are the real audience. Hamann does not care about the public. He will never care about the public at large. He only cares about particular individuals. This is part of his strange genius. So he follows this dedication with a quotation from Persius and then another dedication to the public or nobody, the well-known. Now one can detect in this attitude toward the public an echo, a reverberation that's going to show up in Kierkegaard. If Kierkegaard's thought cannot be abstracted from the peculiar stylistic force of his writings and his adoption of various pseudonyms, his biblical explorations, his revulsion at the crowd, and his insistence on being understood only by certain intended readers, these are all things he simply learned from Hamann. One of the many ironies of Hamann, one he therefore shares with Kierkegaard, is that the harder he works to obscure his own voice, and he works very hard at it, to erase himself from a text, really the more unmistakably his own it becomes. His style emerges in just that way. This is how Hamann facilitates an encounter, by becoming radically particular. His attitude toward the crowd is simply that this is a nobody. They have no views. They have no standing. They have no life. They have no history. There is a nobody there. Only individuals are real. And so as far as concerns what Hamann sees as the mainstream of the Enlightenment, that which he's reacting to, his response can only be to become a more radical enlightener. Not a counter-enlightenment figure, but to take the best impulses of the Enlightenment and plunge more deeply into them, to forge forward in thinking, but to really treat the individual. And in this way, Hamann wants to save his friends, to rescue them from the crowd, from what he sees as just pure intellectual fads, a kind of fake thinking, because it belongs to nobody and has no real seat in life. It must be said, I suppose, that this initial engagement with Behrens and Kant is unsuccessful, except that it does sustain and extend his friendship with Kant. And that friendship is going to become incredibly important. Hamann, as an avid reader of English literature, and literature in English, I should put it, it is Hamann who will first read David Hume. It is Hamann who will recommend Hume's writing to Kant, and it is therefore Hamann's influence which will result in the provocation that disturbs Kant and arouses him from his dogmatic slumber. The critical Kant arises because of his friendship with Hamann. So in that way, if in no other, Hamann's place in the history of philosophy is secured. But what Hamann's really after in these interventions, and they will start occurring one after another, not just with Behrens and Kant, but with various other major figures, it's something deeper. It's a point about the relationship of writing and language and God that is almost impossible to summarize. So the next writing I'd like to look at is just a few years after the Socratic Memorabilia. It comes about in 1762 as a result of an extended engagement with the biblical critic Johann David Michaelis. The piece is called Aesthetica in Nuce, and if any single writing of Hamann's deserves to be treated as a theological classic, it might be this one. Again, it's a short piece. I think it comes to 14 or 15 pages in the German original. But it is staggeringly complex. I'll begin just with a simple quotation from Hamann. Poetry is the mother tongue of the human race. As the garden is older than the plowed field, painting than writing, song than declamation, parables than logical deduction, barter than commerce. Hamann's point here is that what is basic, what is original in human life, what is sort of the ground of all of our activity, is already complex and aesthetic. It marries the rational and the sensual without division. And so, Hamann is concerned that a rationalist biblical critic like Michaelis, whom he refers to in various ways throughout the text, once as the Archangel Michael, another as learned rabbi, these are all playful and joking names, Michaelis cannot understand Scripture as poetry, that is, as a sensual kind of imagery, as the stuff of creation which is actually older than any abstract reasoning or logical form. In other words, what leading figures of the age were hoping to sort of purge from Scripture, all of its rough edges, all of its strangeness, its very humanity and earthiness, that is precisely where Hamann sees its glory. To make a comparison which he never made, one could look to the version of the Bible produced, or rather of the Gospels produced by the American one-time President Thomas Jefferson, who cuts out all of the miracles and arranges the sayings of Jesus and attempts to organize some nice, neat, digestible system. No one could be more opposed to that than Hamann. For Hamann, the language of Scripture is the language of creation itself. And so in poetic passage after poetic passage, he goes after Michaelis. He sounds like this. Speak that I may see you. This wish was fulfilled by creation, which is a speech to creatures, through creatures. For day unto day utters speech, and night unto night shows knowledge. Its watchword traverses every clime to the end of the world, and its voice can be heard in every dialect. The fault may lie where it will, outside or in us. All we have left in nature for our use are jumbled verses and the disjecti membra poetae, the dismembered limbs of the poet. To gather these together is the scholar's modest part, to interpret them, the philosopher's, to imitate them, or bolder still, bring them into right order, the poet's. What Hamann means here, well, he means a lot of things at once, but he begins with this ancient aphorism, speak that I may see you. Perception, insight, knowledge come only from speech, and in the first place they come from God's speech, the let there be light that actually illuminated the heavens, and so the only word that can illuminate the imagination. And creation itself, in Hamann's view, is therefore nothing but that speech. It isn't that God spoke and then the world was made in sort of a subsequent action, but the speech itself is creation. And furthermore, not just at the beginning, but even now, creation is nothing but the constant reverberation and communication of that speech, a speech to creatures through creatures. One thing speaking to another. For Hamann, in that way, all things are living, all things are speech. The problem, of course, is that we do not hear this. We do not perceive this in the world. The fault may lie where it will. Outside us, some problem in the world, some defect, some catastrophe, or in us, our sinful nature, the obscurity of our minds. But in either case, all we have left in nature for our use are jumbled verses. Here he refers to something called Turbat verse. This was an exercise used in German education in which lines of poetry would be sort of cut up and sprayed around, and then it would be the job of the student to reassemble them. And so the dismembered limbs of the poet, that is the poet himself, the one who speaks in creation, is, as it were, cut up and crucified in it. The scholar can attempt to gather these pieces together. The philosopher can attempt to imitate these pieces. But for Hamann, the work of the poet is greater still, to bring them into right order. Here he means not only the poetic works of humans and our creative speech, but especially the work of God as poet, who alone is the Redeemer of all things. So he goes on. Hamann says, "Why should I paraphrase one word for you?" One word here capitalized in a very noticeable way. "Readers ignorant according to your estate, honor, and office, with an infinite number of words." Speaking about all of this speech that constitutes creation, he's really speaking about just one word. And here we hit something central about Hamann's thinking. It's entirely Christological. Hamann has somehow rendered the subject of creation a thoroughgoing Christology. One might say that this, for all of Hegel's profound sophistication, is actually why Hegel, who reviews Hamann at considerable length, he spends approximately 75 pages in a review of Hamann, and he's quite admiring, he can't in the end be anything but frustrated by Hamann, because Hamann simply will not abandon the peculiarity and the concreteness of words, which are the only expression of the one word, in that sensuality. He won't abandon that to rise above it to the concept. Hamann has an argument against any and all rationalisms. Christ is the word, the bodily, sensual word. As he puts it in a letter to Herder, reason is language, logos. This is the marrow bone on which I gnaw, and I will gnaw myself to death on it. If reason is language, then the divisions made by the Enlightenment and by most modern thought, and actually by most ancient thought in the trajectory coming out of Plato, is illegitimate. It's a cutting apart of things that should never have been cut apart. In Hamann's view, God, the Word, condescends to humanity. Not only the Word, but the entire Trinity. The Father condescends to us in creation's beauty and roughness. The Son in his simple humanity and in the soundfulness of words, not the ideal logos. And the Spirit in the, Frankensteinian, shambolic pages of Scripture. Hamann does not have an idealized view of what Scripture is. He's right with the most radical critics in that. He sees all the seams on the outside, all the oddities. As he puts it, how much did God the Father humble himself when he not only formed a lump of clay, but also animated it with his breath? How much did God the Son humble himself? He became a man. He became the least among men. He took upon himself the form of a servant. Hamann's point is that language is divine and human. Words are sacramental. And his metacritique of Kant is Luther's confession against Zwingli.